Moderating tonight's event is not me. I've invited a former fellow, Roja Heydarpour, a former fellow under the Muslim Communities Fellowship. She's a writer and editor. She was born in Iran and raised in New York City. She has worked for the Daily Beast, the New York Times, Al Monitor, Columbia Global Reports, DevEx, and others. She also teaches citizenship classes at the Bay Ridge and Kensington branches of the Brooklyn Public Library, teaching a mix of students ranging from Chinese to Azari to Tajik to Pakistani and Bangladeshi. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Roja Heydarpour.
Hello. How's everyone doing? Okay, so I was a fellow last year, and I'm excited to moderate a conversation with the fellows this year. They're going to each read a little bit, and then we're going to have a conversation. So first is Roshan Abraham. He's a freelance journalist who has written for The Verge, Village Voice, Motherbird, and City Limits. Roshan's also a poet and essayist who curates Final Fantasy, a monthly reading series in Crown Heights. So, Roshan.
Thank you. Oh, this is very easy to use microphone. Thank you. You don't have to turn it as one might with a different microphone. How's it going? A lot of unfamiliar faces. That's fine. That's fine that none of my friends came. I actually don't mind. This will be live streamed, so I can link to it. All right. Okay, so I'm going to read a piece that I wrote. It's called "When Convictions Follow Immigrants for Life." We get 5 minutes each, so I'll just stop at 5 minutes. I didn't plan this well. I'm sorry. We'll extend it to 7. Okay. As rain and sleet fell on New York City during the early evenings of the winter's first nor'easter on the second day of March, immigrant rights leader Ravi Rugbir sat in a small room near the entrance of the Holy Rood Church on West 179th Street. He had been in immigration detention only a few weeks prior, but now he spoke to a tiny group of 7, mostly older community members who braved the weather for a monthly community meeting with council member Idanis Rodriguez, who invited Rugbir to speak. Rugbir spoke broadly about activist movements and moved hurriedly from topic to topic. After referencing Black Lives Matter, Muslim rights, and attacks against women, he summed up his talk by saying, "You have a bunch of old, racist, white supremacist men who are trying to control our lives." The pace and broad scope of his talk was perhaps a result of his now limited time in the country. He was fighting a deportation order issued earlier in January, and despite an ongoing lawsuit against the government and a stay of removal, had nearly exhausted his legal options. Behind him, the children of Amanda Morales, a woman who has taken refuge in the church since August while fighting her own deportation, ran around the pews, laughing and playing a game of freeze tag. It was a quiet meeting, especially when compared to the chaos that had kicked off in the streets in front of Varick Street Detention Center months earlier. At the beginning of the year, Rugbir and another activist with the New Sanctuary Coalition, a faith-based immigrant rights nonprofit that Rugbir co-directs, were detained by ICE and put in deportation proceedings connected to prior criminal convictions. Jean Montreville was deported to Haiti in January. Rugbir was detained at an ICE check-in on January 11th in what turned into a showdown between NYPD and immigrant activists who were choked, shoved, and arrested by the officers. The incidents led to both an upswell of community support and eventual blowback. A rally at Judson Memorial Church on Martin Luther King Jr. Day after Rugbir's arrest drew over 1,000 people, many of whom knew Rugbir personally through his activist work, who crammed into the large church and cheered in support of Ravi. But political figures and pundits also used this as an opportunity to question the criminal pasts of both activists. In Ravi's past was the 2001 conviction for wire fraud after passing fraudulent loan applications. New York One's Errol Lewis suggested in the New York Daily News and on the media that the immigrant rights movement, he was my teacher, I didn't mention that, he was my teacher, so I should have sent in an email before I wrote that, okay. suggested in the New York Daily News and on the media that the immigrant rights movement should select leaders with less complicated histories. Several city council members agreed with him during a February 15th vote to support the motion to ask Congress to grant Rugbeer relief. The reality is that Ravi Rugbeer is not a dreamer. He is a criminal who has defrauded innocent, hardworking New Yorkers, said Councilmember Mark Jonad from the Bronx. The criticisms illustrate a long-standing conversation within the immigrant rights movement that has come into focus in recent months. A splintering created by policies that carve out immigrants with criminal convictions from benefits or prioritize them for deportation. These policies result in lifelong precariousness for those with a wide range of convictions for which they've already served their sentence. They are based on the premise that even when a person has been deemed safe to return to society by a criminal court, federal immigration judges can expunge them from the country, ostensibly for safety reasons. Politicians are quick to defend DACA recipients who have not been convicted of a felony or certain misdemeanors as worthy of citizenship, and some have made efforts to open pathways for educated and economically mobile immigrants. At the same time, those with more difficult paths are treated harshly. But public defenders and activists at the heart of the immigrant rights movement are pushing back on these distinctions and the cruel compromises they inspire, even as federal enforcement has taken a harsher tone. More and more people are engaging with the intersectionality between the justice movements, Rugbeer told me, because the groups have more power when presenting a united front. Rugbeer said that he has intentionally never hid his criminal record all during his career as an activist as an intentional challenge. It says shaming those with criminal carve-outs is part of the problem. The good immigrant, bad immigrant is what causes us to be in this situation in the first place. I'm going to stop there. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Humera using this sheet of paper. Thank you. Humera Afridi is a 2017 Gregory Millard Naiska Naifa Artist Fellow in Nonfiction Literature. Her writing has appeared in several publications, including Granta Guernica, the Journal of Postcolonial Studies, and the New York Times. Humera.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's not too bad. Okay. I'm going to read from a piece I wrote called Midwood Magic, a Coney Island philanthropy of hope. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Who's the last, I murmur as I step barefoot inside the magician's waiting room, fully aware of the grammatically incorrect construction. I glance about, nod a greeting, and make a mental note of the young couple after whom my turn will come, before sitting on a folding chair to wait, sometimes up to an hour and a half. Waiting, an exercise in sabr, patience, a divine attribute. Waiting in a room full of immigrants. Waiting in a room replete with dreams, ranging from fractured to shattered, of lives gone awry. Waiting at times in silence and at others in boisterous chatter. Waiting for the arbiter of pain, for his prayerful magic to influence the lines of destiny. Every scripture in the world, it seems, possesses at least one verse on the blessings showered on those who suffer adversity in patience. A worn faux leather coin-operated massage chair fills one corner of the room. Framed posters of Mecca and Medina adorn the paneled walls. The sound of trucks and buses droning by on Coney Island Avenue and the constant shur of cars being hosed down across the road at the perennially busy giant car wash filter in through two slim windows. A low-income working-class neighborhood, this little stretch of Coney Island is a huddle of auto parts stores, accounting services, a shabby storefront mosque, South Asian restaurants, a grocery, a beauty salon, and a travel agency. The people in the waiting room have traveled across the 5 boroughs and beyond to meet the magician. They have traveled from as far away as Virginia and Chicago and Michigan. On any given day, Russians, Latvians, Kazakhs, Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Sikhs, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Caribbean men, women, toddlers, grandparents, and teenagers form a collage of hope in a room whose walls are tacked with plastic signs and advertisements. Please be considerate and keep the waiting area clean. We also use this area to pray. Meeting time 10 minutes only per family. Be considerate, others are waiting. The magician's magic is a mystery. He speaks sotto voce, and if he speaks at all, it is to say, okay, it will be okay. He is middle-aged, clean-shaven, ordinary, except for the luminosity of his gaze. He nods frequently, as if in conversation with your soul, or your aching heart, or your broken elbow. Before you've spoken the words that you're there to speak, he seems to know what it is that has brought you to his little room. And if you forget to mention the pain in your neck, even as you list the problematic knee and the lower back spasms, he will say it himself, and the left side of your neck, it will be okay. Everything will be okay. This is what we come for, his soothing presence, his confidence that everything will be okay. I first learned about the magician in the winter of my divorce. The timing was serendipitous. All avenues in my life seemed blocked. I took the Q train to Cortelli Road, and in the falling darkness walked briskly towards Coney Island Avenue, struck by the steady gentrification of the neighborhood in the decade since I'd last roamed here. I walked right past the building, then retracing my steps, discovered it sandwiched between a neon-lit Pakistani restaurant and a pharmacy. There was neither bell nor plaque to distinguish the abode. I hesitated before the dull brown entrance, its surface a peculiar laminate, and nudged open the door. A narrow staircase sheathed in worn carpeting snaked up to a landing. To my right, a closed door. Directly across it, another closed door with a pair of brown male leather slippers parked outside. Adjacent to it, a waiting room filled with folding chairs lined up against all four walls, painted in 2 shades of striking orange. Urdu newspapers piled untidily on the radiator. Not a soul in sight. Where was the queue I'd been warned about? I stood outside the waiting room, wretched with sadness, unclear what to do. "You just knock and go inside," said a hushed voice. I turned. A young woman in a chiffon dupatta and kurta churidar has suddenly appeared. "But take off your shoes first." As it turns out, the magician is in fact an ordinary person. However, one could say he's a man of extraordinary faith. He sits in his little room from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every single day of the week, taking breaks for the 2 afternoon prayers and the sunset prayer, at which time he opens his door, slips on his leather sandals, and climbs a flight of stairs to his private quarters on the 3rd level of the narrow little building. He returns faithfully after 20 minutes, and the person whose turn is next rushes up from their chair and follows him up into the little room. How am I doing for time? How much time? 1 minute. The magic of the magician is subtle yet tangible. Whoever visits him returns. Again and again, over the course of years, they return. He is like a prophet, a Guyanese woman said to me once in the waiting room. She had brought 3 of her friends along with her, and even after each of them had been inside to meet him, they returned to the waiting room to linger and chat. A woman from Long Island with a soft round face and carefully curled blonde hair said, "I come with new problems, it works." Dressed in a peach cashmere sweater, she exuded an inviolable calm. Another said, "I drive 3 hours to come and see him. Troubles go away, life straightens out." I'll stop here. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Pearl, who's our next reader. Pearl Bhatnagar is a community organizer, cultural worker, and writer committed to divesting from institutions that harm our communities and reinvesting in collective wellness. Pearl is inspired by the life and works of philosopher-organizer Grace Lee Boggs.
How is everyone? Good. Thank you for bringing Grace Lee Boggs into this space. Are folks familiar with Grace? Want to raise your hand? Cool. I sort of want to pick on someone else to share. Does anyone want to share who Grace Lee Boggs was? Thank you. What I find really moving about Grace is that she talks about the need for us to grow our souls and restore our humanity in movement. So she talks about how the next American Revolution will not necessarily be about any specific type of civil rights or identity politic, but will be about our restoration as people, given that capitalism strips that away from us. What is really exciting to me about Grace, besides her being an ancestor that I'm called to, is the specific location that she grew up in. So how many of you knew that Grace Lee Boggs grew up in Jackson Heights? Yeah, so not many. I think it's like the two people that I talked to about it. One of the best compliments I ever received was when a dear friend said to me that the spirit of Grace Lee Boggs is inside you and inside the souls of all the folks that we love. So it wasn't just directed at me, it was directed towards our community. And since then, I've been trying to seek the places where Grace's soul continues to emerge in the Jackson Heights, larger Queens area. And I'm grateful for the women of Adhikar, who I will be talking about and reading about now, who really embody Grace's spirit of restoring our humanity, collective love, beloved community, and the joy that comes from mutual reciprocity. So I'm going to read a piece about the ways in which domestic workers, nail salon technicians really fought for TPS, for Nepali nationals, this past year, how it was working class women who were fighting for this status for Nepali folks across the country, and not just Nepali folks, but all TPS holders. My passage is a short one, probably shorter now that I'm taking up time explaining it. If you read the full story, you'll learn more about their fight, and we had like this inside joke about what does it mean to read journalism to a group of people, like how does that sound? But I've come out with specific stories of these women, which I'm excited to share with you. Might be dramatic about it. So. Shivani is afraid she will lose her legal status in the United States. She sits with me in a conference room at Adhikar, a women-led worker center in Queens. Shivani paints a portrait of her life as an undocumented immigrant. Fear of separation from her US-born grandchild, wage theft by the owner of her nail salon, and the inaccessibility of healthcare in her old age. She has been undocumented before, and she is bracing herself for a difficult future. Meanwhile, her grandson, whom she babysits regularly, passes the time by her side, doodling on spare sheets of paper. How do you spell worry? He asks no one in particular, eyes still glued to his art. By the time Shivani wraps up her story, her grandson gifts her with a colorful note. Don't WARRY about it, it says in crayon, reassuring his ma that things will turn out all right. Fears like Shivani's are stoked in Queens and in communities across the country, where some 9,000 Nepalis may possess temporary protected status as their only form of documentation. The Department of Homeland Security will decide by April 25th whether to renew or revoke TPS for Nepali nationals. The majority of Nepali TPS holders toil in the most unprotected, underpaid, and undervalued industries today, as domestic workers, nail salon technicians, and restaurant workers. TPS holders have many questions. What would it mean to readjust to a life without basic protections? To navigate not only the threat of deportation, but also workplace dynamics rife with exploitation? How do they prepare for what could be the worst? Pavitra Dash recounts how she worked in a nail salon rife with abuse when she first came to the country in 2010. She labored for 11 hours per day, earning a meager $30 in a setting riddled with sexual harassment. As a masseuse, men would demand that she touch them inappropriately. When she complained to her employers, they told her to lighten up. Dash noted a sign in the salon itself, a direct hotline to the Department of Labor to report exactly the type of abuse she and her colleagues faced daily. She huddled with these colleagues to share her plan. Whereas Dash expected their support, her colleagues instead reminded her that she speaks English well, and that she is young, that she is pretty. Why, they asked, should she bother with this employer if she can go and find work somewhere else? Dash, who had been a human rights defender back home in Nepal, could read between the lines. My sisters were scared that if I sued the salon, the authorities would arrest them as well. She left to find new work as her colleagues had instructed. Prarthana Gurung, who works at Adhikar, understands why undocumented women tend to lay low. When the owner tells you to hide in the back during a state health inspection, you end up internalizing the feeling that you shouldn't be out in the open. There are a number of reasons why it is difficult for workers to demand the rights that they fought for on the books, which actually exist regardless of status. Power dynamics skew heavily against low-wage workers. The process of filing a court case to contest abuse can be difficult, especially as enforcement of these rights is weak at the state level. Trained as generalists, individual investigators at the Department of Labor may not know which rights domestic workers, nail salon technicians, or restaurant workers are even entitled to. When you report, the process of enforcement is so long and so time-consuming, you can get re-traumatized. Workers must ask themselves, do I want to spend time earning money and surviving in this country now, or fighting for something that happened in the past? Most often, they will choose survival, says Shiring Lama, domestic worker organizer at Adhikar. Dash has since organized the same women who dissuaded her from calling the Department of Labor. She says that once the group received TPS, they felt more emboldened to advocate for themselves and for each other. Who would come out in the street and say, I don't have papers, but I need my Bill of Rights? It doesn't work so easily, says Dash. She adds, revoking TPS will set off another earthquake, this time in people's minds. I guess I just want to note that I ended on a somber note, and it's been really beautiful to see the mutual networks of support folks are creating for each other. And I hope that you will read the full story to really understand the ways in which these women are spearheading and continuing to fight even after TPS was revoked, so the fight doesn't end here. Cool. I am so excited to introduce the next person who I feel like I would have met anyway, and it's really dope to meet in this context. Their name is Huiying Bernice Chan. They are a creative nonfiction writer, poet, and cultural organizer born here in New York City. Huiying is a recent VONA Voices alum and a CNAFL traveling fellow. And they traveled to 8 Chinatowns around the world to document stories of resilience across the diaspora. Give it up for Huiying.
I love Pearl. Thank you so much. Now that Pearl has called in Grace Lee Boggs, I'm also going to call in all of the queer and trans ancestors who are unwritten in the textbooks, and also my Gongong and Popo. Can you hear me well? When I was young in the village, my mother said, leaning forward in the kitchen chair at our home in Brooklyn one evening, every day I would call the chickens back home. They walked around all day on their own outside. She put down her phone and cupped her hands around her mouth. I would stand on my tiptoes and call, Gigi, Gigi, and they would come running back. I could see my mother in her preteens, sleek black hair bobs just above her shoulders, standing at the doorsteps of their cement house. The sun had just set underneath the horizon and the sky glowed dark blue. She closed the door behind her and looked up to see her mother walking home. What did their surroundings look like? I had been to Toisan once when I was 6 years old, but lost recollection of the place after. In March of last year, when I was awarded the traveling fellowship that gave me the chance to go back to Toisan alone, I went back carrying a notebook with the names of each of my grandparents and their villages. This is a snippet of my journey to trace the lineages of my family for those also in search of roots. 1. Begin by gathering as much information as possible about the villages and family members before the trip. Every piece of information is crucial. During family gatherings in living rooms and restaurants, I started compiling the names of their villages and family names in Chinese in what would become my root search notebook. My family immigrated to the US in the 1980s, and I am the first generation born in New York. But over the course of 35 years, they have yet to go back and have since never lived in the village. My family rarely talks about the past. But when they do, the stories trickle out in between sipping soup from the ladle and walking home together. They do not happen when and if a camera or voice recorder is placed at the table. Words, then, are what I have to capture these moments. 2. Elders are key. But when you get to the village, how do you find their house and distant relatives? I asked Albert Cheng at the Friends of Roots meeting in San Francisco. Their program took Chinese Americans back to their ancestral villages, and I happened to be in California at the same time. The elders, Al said. Once you get to the village, look for the eldest person there and ask if they remember your family. Sometimes, with enough family members' names, you could hit the jackpot and the answer would be yes. It was a game of well-calculated luck and faith. 3. Keep a list of people who can support you. Remember, you are traveling solo, but you are not alone. On the 2-hour bus ride from Guangzhou to the main city of Hoisan, I sat nervously in my seat, headphones in, unsure if the research would lead me anywhere. I didn't know how I would fare in China, gendered as woman and traveling alone, and how far my Chinese would carry me. As the city skyline melded into expanses of green, I opened my notebook to the page where I kept a list of names of people who supported me. Close friends, mentors, friends of friends, friends in the diaspora hovered on the page. I exhaled. The isolation that comes with solo traveling momentarily subsided. 4. Find resources and institutions in the villages, especially try to locate ancestral halls and zupus. I got off the bus in Hoi Ping, the county next to Hoi San, where my paternal grandmother lived. In my second visit, the Guan Library was finally open. I had heard there was a Guan Zupu, a genealogy book that listed every generation of a family. I was prepared to go back to the library until I found it. I entered the open hall of the library. Calligraphy and framed portraits decorated the walls. An elderly man with black-rimmed glasses wearing a gray suit took me to the office where the genealogists were. He introduced me to Mr. Guan, who, upon hearing my story, said, I wrote the Guan Zupu. We're working on the 3rd edition now. What is your great-grandfather's name? I repeated the phoneticized Chinese I had rehearsed and showed him the characters. He opened a large red book and began flipping the pages. After reading the table of contents, the Chinese barely decipherable to me, he flipped through the pages and stopped at page 1112. He moved his fingers down the vertical lines. Here he is. My heart beat faster. He found my great-grandfather's name. He continued to move down to my grandma's generation. A pause. It looks like her name isn't here, he explained to me in Toisanese. He read Grandma's brothers' names. Only the names of sons are recorded? I asked him. A lump began to lodge itself in my throat. Yes, he smiled almost apologetically. My grandmother-born girl did not matter in history. It turned out Zupus only recorded the names of sons, since daughters do not carry the last name when they marry. I closed the Zupu, seething. 5. Give yourself time and flexibility for changes and new leads. 6, start somewhere. The difference between you and me, my friend Rodrigo, a 4th-generation Chinese Peruvian, said to me in Spanish one night during my travels, is that you can ask your parents what villages they're from, and they may have a hard time remembering. But there's a way you can find out. For me, it's lost. 7. Remember, you are trying your best. It unfolds slowly and there is more to come. My trip was the culmination of many oral histories with family members. I had to face that by the end, not everything was answered. In some ways, I left with even more questions. Women, like my grandmothers, were not documented in the tupus. Who else in my lineage will we never get to learn about? What about the queer and trans ancestors who never had children? Where do I go to find the rest of the tupus? What do I do as the elders are aging? Today, my imagination and comprehension of our collective past has expanded. I left Khoisan able to know my grandparents as children and to set foot in the houses where they were born. I know our city as more than just a color-coded area on the map of a country. I met grandmothers who knew mine when they were young. I found photographs before they faded from the sun after my family left for New York. I am more deeply grounded in who I am because I know more about who and where I come from, more than I previously did when I only knew my family in the context of America. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce Aber Kawas. Aber Kawas has been organizing with the Arab and Muslim communities in New York City since 2010. She is currently the New York City advocacy specialist with the Campaign to Take on Hate of the National Network of Arab American Communities. Please welcome Aber.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm afraid I'll spend too long on the intro, but I will intro my piece. So I came to the fellowship as an organizer, and in my interview I said, I feel like there's so many things that I'm part of and so many things happening in the neighborhood that I'm working in. I never, feel like I have enough time to document them or write about them. And so what I wrote about is a really momentous election that happened in our neighborhood over, many months, but actually was something that was in the making for many years. And I was really proud to be able to write about this moment for my community. And what sparked it was Father Haider, who ran for city council, actually announced after his loss that he was moving to Florida. And so I went to his final sermon. And during his sermon, he gave the story of Pentecost. It was the day of Pentecost. The story, basically, in the Bible, from how I understood it, was that it was a story of when Jesus was telling the disciples that I'm ascending into heaven. And he explains that the disciples, were freaking out, basically. And were like, well, what do we do? And then Jesus told them that, you have the guidance. You have the guidance. You have the Holy Spirit and, what I taught you. And so I think that was really reflective of what our community was facing at the time after the election, Father Haider leaving. So I'm going to get into it. I've learned many times from the past. Many times before, I had volunteered to door knock for up-and-coming candidates who expressed their sympathies for the Arab community in Bay Ridge. I realized that many candidates sought the community's support for their campaigns, but were not truly dedicated to us, a community too controversial and easy to compromise on. Over and over, candidates and elected officials would come to our Eid prayer gatherings, they'd come to our mosques, our community festivals, and they say they would stand by us. Then over and over again, we'd be disappointed as they would turn around and pass policies that hurt our communities while ignoring our asks for progressive legislation on immigration, language access, police accountability, and other issues that affected our people. To me, El Yatim was an ammo, the Arabic term of respect for an uncle or an elder male, but it's also a term I often use to refer to grown men in the community who are a bit out of touch, who like to run things, but are a bit out of touch. And they were, in fact, often the people who would invite these candidates to our community gatherings, despite their contradicting values and actions towards our people, in order to maintain their own self-importance. I met El Yatim while I was working as a youth organizer at the Arab American Association, and he was serving as a board member for the organization. For the staff, he was really the person that we'd call to get an event space, to collect funding for a new air condition, or to give out plaques at our annual gala. I didn't know him well enough to decide if I should trust his politics, morality, and his stake in our community. Would he be a compromiser, a collaborator, a false prophet who would lead us for his own self-interest? And so I decided, before I decided to be a supporter, I listened, I observed, and I paid attention to his stances, especially on one issue that was very close to my heart, that would be the deciding factor in my committing to a campaign that would draw me back into an uncomfortable world of political campaigning. That issue was Palestine. Skip. So going to the end where he loses the election. Sorry. Spoiler. In the end, Pastor El Yatim lost the primary race by 8%, by 8 points to his main opponent, Justin Brannan, who eventually won the city council seat. Despite disappointment, the volunteer supporters of El Yatim himself understood that they were witnessing a victory in Bay Ridge, one that was felt long before the results came out. El Yatim was able to inspire almost 3,000 Arab voters to come out and push the status quo, earning 31% of the primary vote in Bay Ridge. Despite the disenfranchisement of the Arab community in Bay Ridge, which for so long had no power or political presence, the hundreds of doors of Arab families that were knocked on were ones that brought the change and that would push upcoming candidates to take the needs of their community seriously in the future. Most of these families lived in tiny apartments that were neglected and kept unkempt by their landlords on top of storefronts and in multi-floor buildings. The power held by those living in the beautiful brick houses, dangling American flags and touting signs of Republican Trump-supporting candidates was challenged by the very community that these people dubbed as backwards, lonely, and unwanted in their neighborhood. Thank you. Am I up to 5 minutes yet? I don't know. I focused the story actually in the end to not be about Father and Haider al-Yatim, but actually to be about the community in reflection of the disciples freaking out. So in showing that, there's a different story than just a prophetic story, but there's also the story of the disciples and the communities that maintain the movement and keep it going forward. Thank you all for listening. And the next person who is, I think, our final reader is a good friend of mine, Sarah Moawad, who actually I had been needing to meet for a very long time, and we ended up meeting in this space. So Sarah has covered issues related to the Middle East, Arab, and Muslim diaspora communities as a writer, editor, and translator. She was the Egypt and North Africa editor for the online publication Muftah magazine. That means key. She had interned at Al Jazeera English in Cairo and WBUR in Boston. So everyone welcome Sarah.
Thank you so much, Abir. I am so honored to share this stage with such incredible writers, organizers, humans, and friends. I love you guys. My story is about an annual pilgrimage that happens in upstate New York to honor one of the greatest... Thank you. I know I'm short. To honor one of the greatest leaders, liberationists, and Muslims in our history. We come as descendants of our ancestors. We come occupying a place in time and space in order to honor that which is best within ourselves. We come as elders. We come as children. We come as youth. Imam Talib Abdul Rashid addresses the crowd, his words intermingling with the thunderous impact of rain on umbrellas. We thank God for giving us the strength and health to be present today, and we must be present today because we are not fair weather revolutionaries. The struggle for revolution does not just occur when the sun is shining. Before him stand 8 men in a rectangle formation facing one another. Their all-white thobes and turbans now translucent, their rain-soaked faces solemn. A red, black, and green flag lies on the grass between them, along with 2 chairs, one cloaked in white, another in the RBG. Thrones for a king and a queen. An embossed bronze plaque on the ground nearby reads Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, and in smaller letters, Malcolm X and Betty S. It was the kind of day that defied expectations, dedicated to a man who did the same. The early beginnings of summer in New York City, those rare, fleeting, magical moments of sunshine and joy before the humidity sets in, suffocating everything and everyone in its path. It should have been one of those days. Instead, I found myself standing on the corner of 116th and Lenox at 9 a.m. in a long-sleeve jumpsuit, boots, and down winter coat, fur-lined hood pulled up as the first of many drops began to fall from a somber, colorless sky. I waited. Nothing came. Where was everyone? It was now 9:30. I grew anxious. Finally, a young couple stepped out of a taxi, umbrella overhead. I could tell that we were most likely going to the same place. I could also tell that they were converts to Islam. The young man stood tall, wearing a fitted kufi, pants that just barely skimmed the ankles, and mustacheless beard. His wife in long black skirt, black hijab, and oversized coat. I approached them with Assalamu alaikum, asked if they knew where the bus was, and we quickly became friends, sharing in our mutual confusion. As the rain intensified, we stood under the awning in front of Masjid Malcolm Shabazz, formerly Muhammad Mosque No. 7, the historic Harlem mosque that once housed a young minister named Malcolm. We made phone calls and asked inside. Nobody seemed to have a definitive answer as to when or where this bus was arriving. Eventually, I ran back to the source, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood on 113th and St. Nicholas. I arrived in time to see two men leaving the mosque, a tall, imposing Caucasian man with a full snow-white beard and matching hair. I later heard some of the others call him Snowman. And a much younger man, possibly his son, both cloaked mostly in white. Relieved, I joined them as they headed towards the meeting spot on 116th, learning they were a part of a group of regulars who came every year from out of town specifically for this occasion. On the bus ride up to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, the final resting place of Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, or Malcolm X, and his wife Betty, Snowman spoke to me about what to expect of the day. I was one of only 3 women on the bus, the only single woman and one of the few newbies. Snowman recognized this and took it upon himself to make small talk. A lot of different groups come to pay their respects to Al-Hajj Malik and Betty Shabazz, not just the Muslims, he told me. You're going to see lots of different rituals and practices. It can be surprising if you're not used to it. Snowman was referring to the annual visitation, a pilgrimage of sorts, to the grave of Malcolm and Betty Shabazz, a ritual that has taken place on May 19th, Malcolm's birthday, every year since his death 53 years ago. The pilgrimage is organized and led by the Organization of Afro-American Unity, a Pan-Africanist organization founded by Malcolm X in 1964, only 8 months before his death. I'm going to jump around. Outside, the air smells of water and earth and prayer. I get off the bus and wander. Elaborate painted faces, ankh necklaces, black power fists, dashikis and head wraps, turbans and hijabs, prayers and invocations and drum circles. The wind renders umbrellas useless and the sky commands respect. I can't help but feel that there is something otherworldly about this day. In Islam, as in many other faith traditions, rain is seen as a blessing and life-giving force from God. The skies are open, and it is believed particularly receptive to prayers during times of rainfall. This inexplicably torrential day in the middle of May also happened to fall this year during the month of Ramadan, the holiest month of the Islamic calendar, a time of reflection, gratitude, discipline, and fasting. This is not lost on the day's speakers, many of whom note the beauty and the blessing of this day. As Baba Smalls notes, this is a time of the year when great cleansing takes place, spiritual and physical. Introspection, contemplation, all of that happens in the process of Ramadan. How long do I have? And I'm reading this passage because the person I'm quoting is in the audience today. As Katie Merriman, a PhD student in Islamic studies who runs the Muslim History Walking Tour of Harlem, observes, a lot of people think about Malcolm X as this isolated, larger-than-life, almost mythical figure, as if the ground opened up and Malcolm X emerged. but he was actually influenced greatly by the people around him. Malcolm would not have been Malcolm had it not been for the influence of people like Marcus Garvey, the Pan-Africanist leader who promoted a return of the African diaspora to their ancestral homelands, and Noble Drew Ali, founder of the Moorish Science Temple of America, the first Islamic organization in America and predecessor to the Nation of Islam. As I look around at those in attendance and listen to speeches from priests, imams, Afrocentric and Black nationalist activists, I think about the complexity and diversity of this legacy. I think about all the different people and traditions who lay claim to his legacy. Those who see Malcolm as a Black nationalist above all else, or as a Muslim first and foremost, who amplify or downplay certain aspects of who he was. Militant Malcolm, Muslim Malcolm, internationalist Malcolm. I think about the power that lies in a life-changing legacy that creates space for so many, but also the contention. What does it truly mean to carry on Malcolm's legacy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Come on up. Okay. Can you fit over?
Did it work?
Cozy, okay.
Are we all sitting?
Yeah, we're all here. Okay, well, congratulations. You all did really well. And I really do recommend going and reading the full stories because they're really well reported, well written. I highly recommend it. So yeah, you guys did a lot of different things and we don't have that much time. So I'm going to start with something kind of abstract. I wanted to talk about like what role do you think waiting plays in the lives of immigrants? Because even though your stories were all different, there seemed to be this element of limbo for everyone. So whether it's like literally waiting in the magician's waiting room, or waiting for your status, or waiting for representation, waiting for the bus. You know what I'm saying? It's like, waiting to find out what your roots really are, stuck in detention. It seems to be, I think, always an issue in the lives of immigrants. And so, just talk about what you thought about that. Did you find any of that in your sources and in your reporting?
Okay, I'll go. I know how to, I have to be forced to facilitate, so I'll do. So I think that because I'm writing about like the Muslim and Arab community, one of the things that I think when you think of waiting is like the idea of patience. And oftentimes when you learn about the idea of patience, it's not about like just the wait to get to what you want, but it's the process of the wait. And I feel with immigrant communities, oftentimes as much as we want things to happen or want things to change, just like in the story that I wrote, we don't always achieve our victories. And in the TPS, story and et cetera, that, we're not always getting these victories, especially at this time. But there was something really important about the process and the movement and the change and the inner strength that, at least for writing about Bay Ridge, that I saw come out of the community in that process of waiting for something that they had been wanting for so many years, wanting an Arab to represent this, the largest Arab population in New York City. And so that's something that I'm thinking about, just the process.
If I may just read a line about waiting in the magician's waiting room. It forced conversations that amongst people who would not normally, you just pass people by on the street, people who are different from you, you wouldn't necessarily have a chance to speak to them. But in that waiting room we did. We spoke to each other, and I've written here in the story, in the crucible of the magician's waiting room, I have come to understand that misfortune and immigration, each in their own way, are equalizers of society. tearing down barriers that would otherwise congeal us into isolate, hierarchical selves. Here we are simply an eclectic pool of humanity, equal in our different and diverse longings.
How about the status? Why don't you talk about waiting for your status? That seems to always be a huge. I mean, my family did it. You always feel like you're waiting, even once you're done. You're always worried it's going to come back, and you're going to have to wait again. So.
Not wanting to speak for anyone because I'm not waiting on my status, but to invoke a quote from the ED of Adhikar, the current ED, Pavitra Kati Benjamin, who said that when we are in the midst of working on a campaign, it's never about the campaign victory, right? It's the container of what happens in between the goal that you're achieving and what you're doing now. And so I think all I can speak to is my witnessing of the ways in which folks created elements of support during that waiting, and how so much of the story is that, right? It's not, it wasn't a reporting of what happened after April 25th and the decision coming out. I think there were lots of journalists, and I heard this to be the case, a lot of mainstream journalists who wanted to talk about TPS only when they learned that TPS wasn't going to be renewed. And that's just a sob story, right? Of like, oh, well, share your contacts of your membership, and we want to hear how they're feeling, the devastation. And this, I think one of the purposes that the story serves in reporting on what happens before that is showing that there is life in those between moments, and there's joyous, beautiful life in between.
Spoken like true activists. You guys are really optimistic. You want to?
It also sucks.
No. Yeah. I was like, the anxiety. No, go ahead.
I think for me, what I'm being called to talk about is not waiting. So my writing, outside of the personal piece I wrote, is documenting the organizing work that's happening in Chinatown, from the current organizing against gentrification to the new jails that de Blasio is trying to build after he closes Rikers, to Chinatown elders who organized in the 60s to 80s. Like, all of that is kind of like me not waiting, and these young people who are organizing not waiting. They're just doing it. They're not waiting until they feel more qualified. They're not waiting until, I don't know, it looks better on their resume to apply for like X thing that they're trying to do. Like, all of these people are not waiting. And so for me, like, tracing my roots in Toisan, I think I was like 22 at the time. And for me, like, I had met so many people who were older, like 45, 50 in the US, who went back then. And so, like, for me to make the trip was largely just, like, not waiting till I became more confident in my Chinese, till somebody could go with me, till I had more answers that I could find in the US before going. Like, all of it was just not waiting.
So much of waiting is an act of faith, and just, what do? You just have to wait and believe there will be a positive outcome.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder if the farther you get from the first generation or the zero generation, if maybe you can not wait as much. I don't know. It seems like, because you did have to wait for your family to even give you little scraps of the stories, which I understand. My family is the same way, right? But then every generation you seem to get a little bit. You don't wait as much, I guess. All right. Okay, so I also just wanted to really talk about the reporting. You guys really did some good reporting. Last year, our batch, we kind of just wrote more. And you guys did some really good reporting. So I just wanted to just ask you, how did you find those stories? How did you choose those stories? was that, imagine you probably over-reported at some point. How did you pick out what to use and what to not use? But just to get into the nitty-gritty, because they're actually very timely, well-reported pieces. So, sorry.
Yeah, I can speak to this one. The reporting was actually the biggest mental block for me. The biggest mental hurdle was asking myself these questions of, do I deserve to even write about a community that is not mine, or that where I feel like an outsider? Who am I to enter this community and try to tell this story? Can I do it justice? This was a huge hurdle for me to overcome, and it took me a long time to feel like I had all of these challenges. Am I going to do it justice? Am I going to tell people's stories in a way that preserves their dignity and respect and allow, and it's not, and I'm not imposing on it. It is a privilege for me to witness people's stories, and to be able to have an avenue to share them. So it was, that was a huge thing.
But even like, how was it on that bus by yourself? I mean, that's a lot of reporting is also putting yourself in very uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
So yeah, being a single woman on a bus full of Muslim men is usually a little awkward.
Yeah.
So, how did you do that? How did you speak to people? How did you get over it?
Well, I had already established a little bit of a relationship with that particular mosque, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem. And so the imam knew me. There was a few people who knew me, so I wasn't like a total like weirdo who they had never seen before. But also I asked myself so many questions by, for example, when I was on that bus, I wore a hijab and I dressed in a specific way. And every time I went to that masjid, I dressed in a specific way because respect for the space and for the community, and B, it helped with access also, and with being able to so that was again a very personal conflict for me. Like, am I being deceptive? Am I misrepresenting myself? Am I, so all of these were like constant ways I was questioning, but once I finally overcame that hurdle and was able to really build connection and build community within this mosque, and learn about the really important work that they're doing, and it was beautiful, and it was receptive and open, and I think if you have the right intentions and you really make a conscious effort to be deliberate in how you report. I think there's a lot of reporting that can come
responsible reporting.
Responsible reporting. Exactly.
And how about you? You spoke with Ravi's wife, right?
Yeah, I spoke to. So with my first story, I'd written about like deportation issues and like some of those specific policy issues that were in that piece I had written about before. So I like kind of cheated in terms of like having. I had some of the sources where people I kind of like knew from other stories I'd worked on, so I kind of like I reached out to people in my network.
You're a professor.
That's not
No,
cheating.
I didn't quote him. I actually, if you read the story, I'm like the whole story. I'm like arguing against him. So I was hoping he would tweet at me or something, but he didn't read it. That's fine. But my second story, which was just published like yesterday, was like more. It's about domestic violence in the Indo-Caribbean community, and I had a lot of the same issues that Sarah was talking about. I had throughout the whole thing, where I felt super uncomfortable about writing. I'm neither Indo-Caribbean nor am I a woman, and I felt like I was like questioning myself a lot as I was writing, and like, is this appropriate? Even though everyone I was talking to was like super excited that I was writing it, but I was like super like. Felt like inadequate or like questioning whether it was appropriate for me to like write the story. But I'm glad that I wrote it, and I felt the same way, that I just felt like really honored to like bear witness, and like people were just like telling me these stories that were just kind of like, I just felt, yeah.
Sometimes you want to stop them and be like, are you sure you want me to write
Right.
this? Like,
So yeah, that's how I felt about that.
Anybody else?
I felt like there were like two kind of difficult parts about reporting for me. One was that like every time we would come and sometimes we didn't even start writing our stories. I'd come and tell like 50 things that happened in our community. We'd be like, write about it. And I'm just like, well, everyone knows. But just because like I was overstimulated with understanding like everything like about Bay Ridge, or I thought I, was, but like not actually understanding that like people didn't know all these things and having to convey that. But for me, the story about Father Khadir, I was actually really conflicted about writing it because, I wrote it a whole year after the election. And really interestingly, during the election, I was almost like a media spokesperson for the election. I will say I was not one of the best volunteers. I only volunteered a couple of times, but there are people who really put their heart and soul into it. I was just happened to be media trained. So I was, interviewed by several different outlets. But again, it's that interesting question of why are we writing and why, do you choose to write from the space that you're from in your community, and why do we even create spaces like this? Because everybody who had interviewed me about the story was not, I think except for one, everybody was not Arab, was not from Bay Ridge, didn't really understand the stakes of what this meant to us. And also when people are reporting something, they're dictating the questions. So I think one of the really difficult things for me was to write about something that I felt was over-reported, even though I was able to provide a different perspective, and also see beyond what I thought the impositions were of like what people would want to know versus what did this really mean to somebody who just grows up in Bay Ridge? What did it mean to witness this? What did it mean to see like aunties like getting like telling like my friends who never even come out to any protest, but their mom is like texting her friends on WhatsApp, and telling them go out and vote. Like that was something that I felt that only like I had access to, and was lucky enough and honored enough to be able to do.
Side note, why did he move to Florida?
Why?
Like a snowbird?
He's not here. I can't speak for him. I think that he was just offered a position, and I'm actually not sure, exactly what the thought process was. But I think that maybe he like, in one way or not maybe he felt, but I think that the election was like a cycle to us, and I think at that point we were like we thought we were at an end point, and so. The work there for that was done because it was leading to something else. But that whole election really kind of, I felt, was a process for everybody that like needed to be rested and then like channeled into something else. Makes sense. I'm not a good reporter. I don't know why.
No, you're a very good reporter. Just felt like odd time. Anyways, go on.
For my piece, actually, is this working? I wasn't, it took me a long time to write the story, also almost a year, actually. I knew I wanted to write about it. I didn't know how to tell the story. I didn't know how to enter it. Because first I thought there'd be a lot more distance. I hadn't planned to insert myself in. But when the only way I could respectfully do it was to insert myself in because, one, it just happened organically. I was going through something, and it became my recourse. It was a ritual I believed in, and I had found this person, who prayed for other people. Looking at it from the outside, looking at it rationally, it's a tradition that may not make sense, And it was only by sitting in that waiting room with people, everyone going through their own personal crises or stories or challenges, that enabled me to tell the story with sensitivity and really with feeling. And it was difficult to report it in the traditional sense because it was anonymous. I wasn't taking anyone's names. I was being respectful also of the person who prays, the magician, as I call him. Yeah.
Which should we take to the audience or one more? Oh, did you want to say something? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add in summary, I guess. Like what I really loved about our group of journalists and Noel is that we threw out this idea of journalism as objective and as things that had to be like separate from like pieces of work that promote activism. We kind of just like threw it all out the door and just like wrote whatever we wanted. And like for me, the reporting process gave me the chance to talk to people in the Chinatown community at events that I would have gone to anyway, but to talk to new people that I wouldn't have talked to, and to like tell my friends that I couldn't talk to them because I had to catch this person before they left. And then this other thing I wanted to bring up that we've touched on too is responsible journalism. We were talking about it over eating brick oven pizza like a couple weeks ago. And like what I learned in this process was that when I'm reporting something that involves someone opening up their feelings or sharing something really vulnerable, I have to be able to hold them in that. And I can't just be there to get a quick quote. As I have been interviewed by journalists before, like people who are just in there to get the quote, leave the event after an hour to go home. I just learned that if I'm asking somebody about like displacement in their community, I have to stay for the end and kind of just like emotionally hold things if I'm asking them to open it. And then although the process of transcribing is tedious, it's also honoring what they said, even though I don't use all of it.
Well, and just quickly then, so how much do you think that this space in the fellowship allowed you to do that, right? Because you can, you do write for other places, but there is something here that allows you to do some objective reporting and then put in a little bit personal, be honest about it, give people space. Do you want to just quickly talk about how this space allows for that? Any of you?
I started journalism school during the course of this.
A stark difference.
Yep, a couple months ago. So it like is worlds apart from this space, which makes this space that much more important. Because we're being taught like really old school, don't use the first person, objective distance, yada yada, whatever. It's like really, really different kind of writing, and it's the same sort of thing. You get a quote, you get a soundbite, there's a formula, you don't put yourself in it, you don't get emotionally invested, and it's been difficult because I do get emotionally invested, and I do really carry those emotions and these difficult stories. So I'm like trying to like force myself into this box where I'm pushing it away, and it just doesn't work. And so I feel like what this space does is so much more honest than that, because I don't know if you can fully remove yourself. But that being said, I think there's a way to do it responsibly, which is exactly what Huiying brought up. Check yourself, just constantly check yourself, check your intentions, check the way that you're presenting, think about your positionality in the space, just always kind of be reflective and think about why you're doing what you're doing and what it means to people, and when you need to step back and just observe. And so this wonderful, amazing, beautiful space really gives you the time and to do that.
Apply for the future fellowships.
Yeah, I suggest it too. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that here it's not just, it can be traditional journalism if that's what you want to write. I love the freedom to approach our stories the way we'd like to, and each story sort of calls us differently. And I've loved the freedom to, do different kinds of stories in the fellowship. And for this one, it made me think of how, this essay was taking my emotional temperature, at that moment, but also conjoining it with what was happening in the community in a very particular moment. And I think we can combine journalism and storytelling and sort of personal essay in the work we do in this fellowship in a way which is really quite wonderful.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience. You have any questions? I know you do. Do you want me to ask another question? It's never over.
It's like someone gives you a timeline involving a check, and then you're like, you do some math, and then you're like, oh, okay, I should finish this. Got it. Everyone agree?
Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. What's the most difficult lesson you learned in this whole process?
Don't overthink it. That's the lesson and also advice for right now.
I think I'll pick up on what we were just talking about the reporting. I felt like I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like many people, including myself, apply for this fellowship being like, this is my chance to get to write, like from my perspective and for the community, and blah, blah. And I think we all spent like months just overcoming that mental block, even though we knew that this space was specifically here to allow for that to happen. We still, many of us had that understanding that we had to be objective and that we had to be professional and, all of those things that we've taught, which, have basically allowed white people to report on all of our lives for like decades and centuries. These are these rules that are made to actually take away our own ownership of the stories. And so, I just remember every single time coming in and then Noelle or Huiying or someone would be like, write about it. It's right, put yourself in it, And I think that was really difficult for all of us to put ourselves in a story, even though, we're constantly angry at the world for not allowing us to do that. There's also a hurdle of overcoming that kind of internalized and like structural way that, we are marginalized within our own narrative.
I think one of the takeaways is like this was like writing stories for this fellowship was like really, really hard, I think. And we were like, I've written for a lot of publications, but this was like really hard. And I think it's because we all took our stories very seriously and we're like very emotionally tied to them. And that made it like really hard to write them. So I think that was the takeaway. I don't know.
So the question is, what was the hardest, most difficult part to overcome with regards to this fellowship? I think I identified a new problem that I feel like we now have to overcome. And so I'm also coming to this fellowship as a community organizer who also is like, okay, this story, that story. What was amazing about this fellowship is learning that in order to be good at what you do, right? I think the role of an organizer is to create the space for more voices to come into the fold. And I think storytelling also allows for that process to happen. Being given the room to be a journalist and sit on a couch with people who have way more bylines than I do. I was high school editor in my school newspaper, but folks have other titles to their names. What I've learned is there needs to be a better bridge between community-based organizations and the folks who write stories about them, right? So how do you change journalism and like the way that journalism is structured so that these in-depth stories where you are investing your time and energy are actually published, right? So what Roshan said around, you have a check and you divide that by the number of hours you're working on it, that's really real. Yes, we were funded to do this work, and I think we all put in a lot more hours than like the math of whatever that works out to be, right? And if this is your profession and this is what you're doing full time, you're not necessarily going to take that time and energy to create those containers for people's stories. And so what does that mean in terms of what dominant narratives end up being in our society, in our communities, and in our world? And what does it mean to shake the foundations of that? I think what this fellowship does is support us in trying to get at those questions. And then I think there's a bigger structural shift that needs to happen. So that's like the next challenge that I'm like thinking about overcoming as someone who at once identified as an organizer 6 months ago and is am leaning into other titles as well.
Hello. For me, I think the most difficult thing was letting go of perfectionism, and in everything in my creative process, like outside of journalism too, if I didn't have like a community of people and like a really caring like person pulling you along with deadlines, I think a lot of my work would just be sitting in drafts, like in my notebooks or like in Microsoft Word, and it would never see like the light of day. And so for me, like even the piece I read, it never felt finished. I was just like, no, Noelle, don't publish it yet. It's not ready. And then I had read it too many times, and like the deadline was passing, and I was like, okay, I don't think it's perfect, but I'm just gonna put it out there. And then people like responded well, and so then I was like, oh, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then the second thing I wanted to touch on was thinking about the limits of written journalism, especially in portraying the lives and complexity of lives of people I want to portray. And so my story that I'm working on now is about garment workers and organizers who organized the 1982 strike in New York City's Chinatown and Manhattan, where over 20,000 workers, mostly women, went on strike when their union contracts weren't about to be renewed. And it's really limiting to have to interview someone and then try to portray everything that I felt and witnessed, like in their house, through written journalism. So I'm trying to figure out where I want to go from there, and that's why I'm also gravitating towards filmmaking and what that can do. But like with that, it would just take forever for an article to come out. So I'm still like grappling with that.
I think for me the challenge really is, and I'm still working through this as I work on I have a couple of stories still remaining to submit. So is one, building trust. So I'm writing about Muslim communities, low-income South Asian immigrant communities, a lot of who have been really adversely affected by 9/11, repercussions of which are still going on, and Islamophobia. So how do I go into these really conservative neighborhoods as an insider, but I'm reporting, so I immediately become an outsider, right? So this is the balance that I want to do it respectfully, and I'm not going in just to tell people secrets. I mean, so this is, as a writer and as a reporter and just as a human being, as a Muslim, as a woman, I'm sort of negotiating a lot of different identities when I go into my neighborhood to write and to report.
So, I don't like that. As far as like y'all working together, what kind of benefits do you guys reap from that? Like the editing process, and like, is there any particular moment where someone like pushed you at a point in writing your story?
Hello. I just needed to check the microphone first. So we workshopped all our stories together, and like I think I told you all last time, like before this, I was not even really a big. I didn't have a lot of faith in like workshopping as like a process, because like because sometimes if you do workshopping in like your undergrad classes or whatever, it's like with a bunch of randos who just like have bad opinions or whatever. But these were like, this was like a really like specifically kind of curated, great set of people who had really thoughtful things to say. And like all the workshopping that we did changed my stories a lot for the better, I think. And I was really grateful for that.
I just want to say, like, there are so many journalists who never have these conversations. Like, this isn't even on their radar. The things that we're talking about how to overcome your own position and reflecting and how do you do justice to these stories and how do you, like, so just having those conversations with this group of people was like immensely helpful. And just to share in that struggle, that like shared struggle that we were all facing. And yeah, Abir was always like, just do it, just write it. Just do it, like just write. Because I was like so in my own head, and it had become crippling where I just like I couldn't get anything out. And so having these people pushing you and caring for you and invested and really there for you in like in a very real way, that was invaluable.
Much like Pearl, I have not like done a lot of writing since high school. No, I'm not saying that. But the last time I workshopped was in high school. So like workshopped my own papers, and I don't imagine things have changed of how people are because from all the times I remember like sharing my work, like any writer would know that's an extremely vulnerable thing to do, to share your work, something that you've been sitting on and thinking about. But oftentimes I feel, and I wrote this in the evaluation, Noelle, people who edit your work kind of have like some of their own ego when they do that, and are trying to like show you how much smarter they are, or how like you didn't see this correctly, like this is how you should be writing this, or this is what I know about this that you're missing. And generally, and I really want to thank my whole cohort, we did not have that. We really had a huge sense of support for one another, and I never, within any of the workshop processes, ever felt like anybody was encroaching on my story or trying to, just put any ego. Everybody was generally trying to elevate each other, or like the whole entire time we were just trying to elevate each other's work. I swear I'm not trying to plug this place. I'm just it felt like a support group, and this kind of writing is really difficult because a lot of people here are writing professionally, but the type of intimate writing that we were doing in this space was very hard to do for everyone, and so having that group, and it's of course because we get to meet, several times, we also got to know each other. And then lastly, I will say, I think like the politics of this space was really important. You didn't have to justify why you are against white supremacy. You didn't have to justify really anything that you were saying. Everybody kind of came from a really similar political background, in that we all understood the struggles of the communities that we were writing about.
Hi, I also want to thank you guys for sharing your stories tonight. And I guess I'm just wondering about like next steps, or sort of what happens when like the story is finished being written, but like the work is not, and where you guys find yourselves in that.
So I truly am seeking the spirit of Grace Lee Boggs in Jackson Heights, and that feels like a lifelong project. And I think rather than just looking into the horizon and imagining that this will happen in the future, whatever this is, naming that the workshop and the 3 articles that I'm writing are manifestations of that vision now was really helpful towards this life goal. I think all the folks that I ended up speaking with over the course of the articles that I'm writing, very much resonated with this vision of what it means to create beloved community, are sort of moving that in action right now. And I feel like I had relationships with many of them, and I intensified my relationships with those same people through this lens. And as we work to create this beloved community, in Queens and Jackson Heights, having had a way to witness them and their stories, and just listening through the ways in which we got together over coffee or tea in our favorite coffee shops in the neighborhood, will be so important as a foundation for what's to come. So just feeling, I guess the lesson there is related back to the waiting question, right? How do we not wait? How do we not wait for what we imagine or envision can happen? What does it mean to know, to like intuit, and to know who those people are? And I guess, like Huiying, know that we're ready, and there are certain resources available to us, right? This might not be the Healing Justice Center on 74th Street that like I'm working in my mind on, but in many ways these articles are that as well, and that was a lesson for me.
I had something to say, and then I didn't feel ready, and then I just took the mic. I wanted to talk about something. Next steps. I think for me, it's continuing to surround myself in community with people of color who identify as like multidisciplinary artists, organizers, creators. In June, I took a manuscript of a story similar to the one I had read to the Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation, which is this space that cultivates writers of color. Woo. And I was in a memoir workshop group with these 9 other writers from like varying ages, different stages in life, different reasons why they're writing. And just being in the sheer presence of each other made us all more motivated to write and to believe in our stories. So I went with like 10 pages of writing, and then a handful of them were like, you need to write a memoir. And I was like, really? You think so? Okay, I guess I'll do that. And I guess like that's how it starts. And that's all I have to say.
I think I'm still figuring out the answer to this question. I don't know if I really have a real answer to this question, but I think the first kind of thing that comes to mind is like, especially as I'm now in journalism school, which teaches you the opposite of all of this, is like, don't be a parachute journalist. Don't like go in, get a couple quotes, and then dip. Like continue. So with this mosque that I built this community with, I'm still in contact with the imams. I'm still trying to, help them figure out what they need, and see how I can be of service. Like I said, it's to think of yourself as being in service of the people whose stories you're writing, and flip the relationship. Don't have it be like you're using them for something. And so the next story that I'm writing is about the assistant imam of this mosque, who is a prison chaplain and who runs a substance abuse recovery program for Muslims. And so figuring out how to support him in that. We're, always talking about it. So it's like, if you're going to be there, invest.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. One theme that I noticed throughout a lot of the stories was solidarity. So within a community or even across generations, which is refreshing. I think a lot of the stories that we hear are about acts of like individual courage or individual tragedy. So I think it's powerful to share stories of solidarity. And I was wondering if you view writing as a way of building solidarity? Like how?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's always been pretty integral to how I view the purpose of writing in my life. I think it's never been like a solitary thing. It's always been embedded in people and in community and in relationships. And that's why I'm always so plagued by that question of how do I do it justice and how do I do it right and how do I elevate or amplify stories that need to be amplified. And yeah, with this specific pilgrimage that I wrote about, it was so many different groups. And if you read the full story, there's, you know, quotes from a bunch of the different groups that were represented and how they see living out Malcolm X's legacy and what they think of when they think about continuing the work. And some of them spoke about, you know, supporting political prisoners. Some of them spoke about, you know, police brutality and how the community is reacting to these things. And it was beautiful because some of these groups believed in entirely, you know, different things. And there was a lot of difference, but there was such a beauty in that togetherness and coming together for that cause and honoring this person and acknowledging that we stand for something and we're fighting towards something and we're building towards something and we might not even know what that looks like yet, but there's the intention is there. Yeah, so I think I definitely think writing is powerful and can do that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm still like reflecting. No one else?
That's
Can everyone stay here for a second? I'll be right back.
Wow.
Ooh, something's gonna happen.
What's gonna happen?
Talk amongst yourselves.
So Noelle has seen many different facets of each of us, the good and the bad, throughout these 8 months. And so we got him something as a token of appreciation. The first thing here for Noelle is a dad mug. You are the coolest dad in the galaxy, and we want to tell you that you're out of this world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does someone want to do this?
I'm a proud dad.
Noelle really was like our father this whole time, nurturing us. And also we're actually not sure if you're a tea person, but because we're all writing about different communities and the fellowship challenges us all to like choose a neighborhood or community to write about, we all chose our favorite teas from our respective communities to share with Noelle. So you have a tea basket from all of us so that you can put the tea bag in your dad mug. But I think all of us wanted to just thank Noelle for dealing with us and just infinite patience and being there. And he really is a great, what do we call you, supervisor? We're just going to call you dad. He's a really great dad to all of us. So thank you, Noelle.
Thank you. You want to give it to him? And that concludes our programming for the night. Thank you for joining us.